Good morning, everybody. Hey, thanks for coming on Saturday morning to join us for the opening panel discussion and for being part of discussions this whole conference. It's been really wonderful to see different folks at the table, right? And a common theme has been energy and just transition. So in this panel, we're going to talk a little bit about energy, right? We know a lot of the energy we take for granted, is based on the exploitation of workers and extraction. And we want to dig a little deeper than often is done when we want to complicate some of the oversimplified versions of, structures that are seen as solutions. And we also want to simplify, right, what might seem overcomplicated. And that's why we brought together this panel, really focusing on our values and our relationships, right? And so we're gonna really, that's the theme, is all of us are doing work in different communities with workers, and we wouldn't be here if we weren't committed to the idea that everyone should have a say and that we need to work together to find the best solutions for our communities, right? There's not like off the shelf recipes that we can just implement that are gonna fix all our troubles. Like, we need to be in dialogue and we need to organize to make sure that we have control, right? And workers have control, communities have control around issues that we present as solutions to energy. So I'm gonna just talk for a couple minutes, and then each speaker is going to introduce themselves and talk about, they might, get into the nitty gritty around energy, and also they might talk about community labor relationships, which is kind of the overarching theme of this conference also, right? So my name's Camilo Viveiros. I work at a labor education center, and I also work at a welfare rights organization that's focused on utility justice for a couple of decades. And we know, so I, on a daily basis, grapple with these issues of making sure that utility workers have justice and build solidarity for folks working on the front lines of climate justice, and also work directly with folks who are fighting to lower utility costs, right? So we know that public utilities has definitely some benefits and came out of populist movements in the past. And there's a lot of communities in the United States that wouldn't have had electrification if it weren't for, public utilities, because by the profit motive, a lot of utilities just didn't have the incentive to electrify different communities, right? And we also know that their structures aren't solutions without looking at practices, right? And the content of those structures. So I'll give just a couple quick examples. The Tennessee Valley Authority is very famous, right? And we know that's a great example of electrification in communities, but we also know that it's struggled with representation, right? It hasn't represented the ethnic or racial diversity of the region, and that isn't to throw away all the important aspects of it, but we want to delve into these contradictions and also come up with solutions which are based on our values in organizing, right? This is a cooperative energy co-op in Texas, the Cherokee County Electric Cooperative Association, right? And once again, it's the story of people organizing a co-op, a consumer co-op to provide electrification in Texas. But there's contradictions there as far as they had legal litigation. Some of their members were having their utilities shut off without notice, right? And behaving more poorly than some of the corporate utilities, right? And so then, probably the most famous Nebraska Public Power District. We know the rates in Nebraska are 40% lower than a lot of places like Massachusetts or Rhode Island. So we need to move toward more, cooperative and municipally owned. But right, Nebraska isn't exactly a leader in fossil-free green energy, right? So all of these things aren't to say we are looking for things to delete our relationships. They're things that we recognize the contradictions in different structures. So in the next slide is, I'm in control. It's a simple Venn diagram that we can lose sight of when we're kind of taught through social media to just, what do we object to? What do we have a difference with each other, right? And that gets amplified. But we have self-interest in our communities. That's why we're here, right? And we all have something to learn from each other. But it starts with figuring out, what's that in the middle, right? Where we can all agree upon, right? And we all kind of agree with the idea that we want more people in the room, we want people at the table, but that's only one part of the conversation. The other part is making sure that we listen and making sure that we recognize mutual self-interest, right? And it's going to look different than, like I said, like prepackaged solutions that are coming from different places. So that's why I'm really excited to be here to learn from organizing happening here. And I'm just going to talk for maybe one more minute. We can go to the next slide. I could just give a couple little stories. Oh, I'm in control. I'm going to hand this off. Okay. And
here you go.
So, this is an example, right, of the utility group I work for in Rhode Island called the George Wiley Center. And, we have cut the number of utility shutoffs from 30,000 households, which is almost 60,000 people, down to 15 through a variety of direct action, class action lawsuits. So for example, I don't know if people are familiar with this thing called water fire in Providence. It's this interesting thing. And, you go and they blast music and you walk around and there's, it's an atmospheric experience. So the utility in Rhode Island at the time, which we kind of ran out of town, called National Grid, they didn't support a percentage income payment plan. So we did a direct action where our members came and took over their booth that they spent like $70,000 to do this PR thing. So we did a direct action and we were ready to do civil disobedience. The police came and we shut them down. We leafleted, this is thousands of people at this event. So the next year, workers in Massachusetts that work for National Grid were locked out. So we said, okay, come on down. They're sponsoring it again. And so that's what, National Grid puts profit before safety. The steel workers came, and we also invited Climate Action, the 350 affiliated organization. And, we had a larger scale protest. Each organization did different actions, like the steel workers projected on this building, that messaging. Climate justice activists projected on that river information about climate change, right? And so, that's just one example of how we can kind of build up solidarity. And another quick example from the George Wiley Center is when in Rhode Island, steel workers were locked out, and this is before I was there in the 80s, they knew we built solidarity. We wanted to be in solidarity. So they would notify the George Wiley Center when a replacement worker was sent to shut somebody off, right? So then our members could go and create a blockade and stop the scabs from shutting people off, right? Those type of actions in solidarity might seem impossible when you're sitting, away from each other, when you haven't built the trust, where you're just emphasizing the things you disagree upon, right? But we're hoping, Rhode Island, and we know there's a lot of great work here in building those relationships and figuring out how to build a stronger movement together that is really equitable and just for workers, for communities. So without further delay, let's move on to the conversation. Each person's gonna share from their perspective, and then we'll open it up to questions and answers afterwards. So I'll let folks introduce themselves. Isaac's gonna go first. Thank you so much for joining us.
Yeah, thanks. What a great kind of like introduction and settings. I want to start and say thanks to Camilo for kind of like pulling us all together. I think I wouldn't have been able to pull this group together in particular, and it's exciting to be here in Maine and talk with all of you. I want to also thank Matt and Katie who are here, and Zach who have just pulled off 3 or 2.5, 3 days of like some incredible learning and content. And thanks to all of you for joining us on I'm told it's Saturday morning. My name is Isaac Sevier. I use they and them pronouns. I'm the executive director of Public Grids. So I'm here to talk to you about what is Public Grids, what do we believe, and then also just to talk to you about what we're doing across the country. So at Public Grids, we believe that there's a world where the utilities that light our towns and our cities and the utilities that heat our homes serve the people and the planet and not shareholder profits. Our mission that we're trying to build is to inspire everyday people with the truth that public power can lower the cost of living. As you know, we're in a severe cost of living crisis, and protect our future at the same time. So what we do on a day-to-day basis is that we empower organizers with the training and expertise to assemble those winning coalitions that can break through the corporate propaganda about investor-owned utilities and the political deadlock that we seem to be stuck in across our country. We also build research and analysis explicitly to build that public support so that normal folks can understand the energy system and be used by all of our movement partners. That way, when we show up, we really can back up our elected politicians who are fighting the utilities with us and counteract the influence of lobbyists and really, really deeply funded political opposition. So what am I doing here in Portland, Maine, a city that I now have been in 3 times in the last 2 years because of this being such a great outpost for the public power movement? This time I came to really listen and to learn from all of the great labor organizers and instructors and educators that have been here, and to ask for some more help as we leave this place. So I wanted to just share a little bit of what I learned over the last couple of days sitting here trying to be a good student again here at the University of Southern Maine. So I learned from Rick Levy, who leads the Texas AFL-CIO, about how climate change is what got the attention of the Texas labor movement in no small part because of climate change's effect within the deregulated energy system that they have, and about how many people in Texas can't keep the lights on during a heat wave or a cold snap because of deep and systemic poverty. I learned from Leticia Zavala from El Futuro es Nuestro, It's Our Future, how growers in North Carolina and throughout the country are refusing farm workers' demands for their right to work safely for heat protections. And I listened to her story about how workers who are picking the food for our meals have no air conditioning in their homes after a full day in the extreme heat. They never get the chance to cool off after a hard day's work, and their choice becomes to either die in the field or to never work here again. I learned from Alicia Kang, who's with the National Employees Union of Canada, about the company town of Jasper in Alberta, Canada, which evicted its own workers to move the management back in so that they could get their operations up and running and build some more profits. And she showed us the devastation of those wildfires that climate change accelerated. She showed us the asbestos piles lying on the ground, and she called us into solidarity to reject the idea that it's okay if someone else is exploited as long as it's not me. I learned from Todd Vachon yesterday from Rutgers a framework to think about these issues as related through a transformative just transition, one that's focused on system changes that are driven by the labor movement that could help us build a future beyond capitalism and eliminate inequality. And I'm still thinking about the films from Vivian Price from California State University, who opened us up this week through showing us the same conditions that I just described in so many different places and sectors, and how those are being recreated right now in the clean energy industry. Her films showed us the common conditions that are facing workers who are trying to survive in a community with a coal plant closure in South Africa, and the workers who are building and running a new lithium extraction operation in the Atacama Desert in Chile. So I want to just say thanks again to Katie and Matt and all those folks for those lessons. And then I want to ground those ideas in the material conditions that we see in our communities and facing our workers today. In a state like West Virginia, which has provided the energy that's built the backbone of the American Industrial Revolution, 1 in 3 families can't pay their energy bills today. In any given state, that number is usually somewhere around 1 in 4. And I just saw some new statistical analysis from Columbia University in New York City, the most unequal city in the United States. There, 6 out of every 10 families, 6 out of every 10 families can't pay their energy bills today. So this means that when they can't pay their bills, they're either building up debt. Today, there's $17 billion of utility debt that exploded during the COVID pandemic's peak in 2020. That's still hanging around, $17 billion. And in a new development just this week, on Tuesday, the DOGE crew up in DC cut the staff of this really vital low-income energy assistance program called LIHEAP. It's the only nationally available lifeline program in the US for energy bills. Folks can only get this when they're at their wits' end. It is the last resort for finding a way to help pay your energy bill when you don't have money to do it. The staff for running that program have all been cut, and we don't know if they're coming back, which means that $4 billion of energy assistance that would have been coming to everyday Americans might not come again next year. So I've worked on these issues for the last 7 years, and unfortunately, I don't have good news either. We are going to experience a summer of shutoffs, I think. Something that we haven't seen before in our lifetimes, and something that is worse than what we experienced during 2020. So with that very cheerful update, I want to say, what does public ownership and what does public grids have to do with this story? I told you what I learned from everyone here, and now I want to ask for help. We have to have strong, organized unions to fight for our future. I think that these jobs have to have all of the protections that workers have died and fought for and are still struggling to win today. But in the electricity system today, good union jobs are being pitted against affordability. This is because of a fundamental design in the for-profit utility system, which is meant to and is legally required to maximize utility profits at all costs. Every dollar under the electricity system that's invested in that growth and the expansion that we need is passed on to the very folks that need that service, right? And so what this means is we can only upgrade the grid. We can only decarbonize the grid. We can only make sure that we have clean and reliable energy if bills continue to go up. That's the business model that we have today. And there's no way around that without the kind of transformative just transition model that Todd shared with us yesterday. But I kind of refuse. And so many of my comrades in the public power movement also refuse to believe that the choice in front of us is either good union jobs or keeping the lights on for those millions and millions and millions of Americans, right? And when I say millions, I mean somewhere around 50 million working American adults can't pay their electricity bills, right? Just to put that number in context from poor. So that's the utility company's agenda under the for-profit model. And they're using that model to pit us against one another, to pit communities against workers when we know that workers are our communities, right? And that we can only rise up together. So the questions that I'm working on with public grids that I'm hoping to talk with more of you about after our session and in the Q&A, and just as we leave the room and go back into our communities, is how do we advance economic democracy? How do we advance a world where labor unions and communities together own the energy system, not just work for the energy system or use? How do we own it together since we make it and we use it? How do we advance a guarantee of universal and free electricity service or electricity for all? I think this is critical when we think about the many seniors, working families, families with children, single mothers who can't keep the lights on today. And how can we build some bridges together? This is really what I came here for, is to talk about how do we do that bridge building, not just between climate and labor, but also between our workers and our communities. How do we build that bridge from a world that we have today with shutoffs and energy poverty into a world where everyone has a guarantee to this fuel that's supposed to be the backbone of the green energy transition and of climate change? And how do we get from now, where we're experiencing climate and economic devastation everywhere all around us, to a union future where no one, union or non-union worker alike, is sacrificed in the supposed name good that this clean energy provides? So I'm excited to hear the other perspectives from the great panelists here. And I'm here to listen and work together as long as it takes to build a new way forward for electricity service. And just thank you guys for your attention.
Right. So my name is Mireille Bajani. I use she or they pronouns. I am the co-executive director of Slingshot, which is a regional environmental justice organization that works alongside communities most impacted by environmental health threats to take aim at polluters and build community power. I'm also the facilitator of the Fix the Grid campaign, which is a regional grassroots effort in the 6 New England states aimed at governance reform of our regional grid operator, ISO New England, to increase transparency, accountability, and affordability, and of course, moving towards renewable energy. In terms of my role here today, I'm going to talk a little bit about a specific example of community ownership that we have in Massachusetts, and how that fits into this story in terms of the pluses and minuses that come with that model and the potential that it has as someone who lives in Western Mass myself. So I'm going to talk about municipal light plants in Massachusetts. And as I mentioned, I'll talk a bit about first of all, what is an MLP that we have a bunch of in Massachusetts, and what are the advantages and drawbacks that come with that? And what does that mean for what we can learn in terms of accountability and organizing? So what is a municipal light plant? So a municipal light plant is a utility owned by a municipality. And it's in contrast with investor-owned utilities that Isaac was talking about that are owned by private shareholders. So municipal light plants are nonprofit entities. They are not looking to make a bunch of profit for their shareholders. They're looking to serve their community directly. In Massachusetts, we have 41 MLPs that serve 50 different communities, as you can see on the map here. And collectively, they account for about 14% of our electricity distribution in Massachusetts. And I should say, for a lot of this information, I'm leaning on my own experience working with communities that are in MLP jurisdictions. And also the Massachusetts Climate Action Network has put out an MLP scorecard a few times. And so a lot of this information is pulled from their most recent scorecard evaluating all of the MLPs across the state. And so the advantages that come with MLPs, one is affordability. The average MLP customer pays less than half the rates that investor-owned utility customers pay. Some of them pay nearly a quarter as much. And again, that is because investor-owned utilities, as Isaac was mentioning, are trying to make as much money as they can for their shareholders. And so there's a whole piece of the pie in that situation that isn't present for MLPs. They're also better when it comes to reliability. MLPs were found to be 6.5 times more reliable than investor-owned utilities based on available data. Not all MLPs and investor-owned utilities necessarily share the data for this analysis, but in terms of how quickly service is brought back online after a disruption due to weather or something like that. And by the way, in Massachusetts, our 3 primary investor-owned utilities are Eversource, National Grid, and Unitil. And then MLPs also offer more flexibility. They have a smaller customer base and they can own their own electricity generation, which is in contrast to IOUs. Companies like Eversource and National Grid can't own their own power plants or solar panels, but MLPs can. which means that it's easier for them to try new things, especially because they have a less of a big business to shift from one thing to another. So they can build their own solar projects. They can invest in certain power plants or not in others. They can make those decisions for themselves. There's also, in theory, more accountability to community. The MLPs are run by an elected or appointed board of commissioners that usually has regular public meetings that folks in the community can attend, can ask questions. There's, just like any other public official in town, in theory, like the mayor or the city council members, the MLP commissioners are a similar role. And then there also are community ties. Because it's a local company, the employees are local. They're right there working for their own town. The leaders of the MLPs are people you might run into at the grocery store, or they're your neighbors. There are personal relationships with the folks who work for this company, in contrast with an Eversource or a National Grid that has thousands of employees and where the leadership is, maybe hours or a state away making decisions that are going to impact your own community. In terms of innovations, because they have more of that flexibility that I mentioned, there are things that MLPs can do that other utilities can't. And there are examples of a few MLPs really pushing the envelope and trying out new things. One is the town of Groton, Massachusetts, that has a mandatory residential time of use rate. So what that means is that they charge a different rate for electricity at different times of day. During peak hours from 4 to 8 p.m., they charge 50 cents a kilowatt. And then in contrast, the rest of the time, they only charge 5 cents a kilowatt. And so that incentivizes residents, when they can, shift their energy use around to use more energy during those off-peak hours and reduce peak demand, because that 4 to 8 p.m. window is when most people are using power. And that's when we end up cranking up additional power plants that are more polluting and more expensive to cover that electricity usage. And so by having this mandatory time of use rate, they're able to shift when people are using power and make it overall less expensive. And then another example is in West Boylston, where they have a community shared solar project. So they built a 1.5 megawatt array in town, and they use virtual net metering. So residents could sign up for this program to indirectly benefit from, they don't have the solar panels on their own house. They're located in one central location in town, but they're all benefiting from the cost savings. And it was actually so popular that they allocated all the shares for that solar project, and there's a waiting list for people who want to be part of a program like this. So there's a lot of good things happening thanks to MLPs, a lot of great things that they can do. But unfortunately, there are also some drawbacks. One is that MLPs in Massachusetts are less regulated than investor-owned utilities. And as a result, a lot of them that don't have leadership that's actively pushing for the energy transition are further behind on clean energy than investor-owned utilities. 26 out of the 40 MLPs evaluated in the MCAN scorecard I mentioned have no clean energy in their mix. So and that's largely because they don't have the same requirements under state law to move towards clean energy as quickly as investor-owned utilities, which I'll show in a minute. They also, because they're smaller companies, have fewer resources for energy efficiency. So they do have some rebates and incentives and programs for residents to move towards weatherization or other measures to increase energy efficiency, but they're not able to offer as much money for those programs as a lot of investor-owned utilities are, and other state programs. And half of the MLPs don't offer any energy efficiency programs. And then another piece of it is that the environmental justice component isn't quite there yet when it comes to MLPs. They have pretty meager energy assistance programs compared to IOUs for residents who are struggling to pay their bills. Only one municipal light plant in the state so far has an established environmental justice plan. That's Ipswich. And part of this is, to be honest, most of the MLPs in Massachusetts are in communities that are less racially diverse and wealthier than the state average. It's a lot of the whiter, more affluent communities that have these municipal-owned utilities. And as a result, they're maybe not thinking as much about environmental justice, though they're starting to have, some of them have made statements or have adopted policies, even if they don't have quite a full plan in place yet. So it's something that's coming. Here's an example of how they are less regulated than IOUs. So you can see in terms of renewable portfolio standard and other right? I'm not going to go through all these acronyms. It's not really the important thing, but you can see that investor-owned utilities are subject to a lot more rules and regulations under Massachusetts state law than municipal light plants. So I want to talk about one specific example of an MLP and what that has looked like in communities working towards the energy transition, which is the Peabody Municipal Light Plant, or PMLP. So Peabody was one of the last cities in Massachusetts to become a green community, which is a program that cities can opt into. They have to fill out some paperwork and establish some plans, and then they can basically unlock tens of thousands of dollars in state funding for green and for sustainability and renewable energy projects. And Peabody just didn't get their act together to make this happen for years and years. The PMLP meetings, the municipal light plant, were poorly attended. Nobody was really paying attention to what was happening with the MLP. You know, they had low rates. That's all that residents were really seeing from their end of the story. And the commissioners considered themselves completely separate from city council, their own body, not really accountable to anyone. And in 2021, we heard about a proposal for a new gas-powered peaker plant. So one of these plants that just gets turned on for a few hours on the hottest and coldest days of the year. And this peaker plant was proposed to be built in an environmental justice community on the same site as two existing gas-powered peaker plants within 2 miles of several other environmental justice communities. There were several reasons this is a bad idea, including the fact that it was 2021 and we didn't need to invest in more gas generation. Instead of, we could have, we actually did analysis demonstrating that we could have been, this could have been a battery storage project instead. So I worked with the residents in Peabody on a campaign to stop this peaker plant. And a big part of it was starting to show up at the PMLP meetings and engaging with the commissioners and asking a lot of questions and asking for transparency, because this project at that point had been in the works for 5 years and the community had known nothing about it because there hadn't been public meetings. And as a result of all of our showing up and asking questions, one of the PMLP commissioners actually resigned. And in his resignation, essentially said, too many people are showing up and asking questions. Which is democracy. Which is not what you want out of a public official, someone who's elected by his constituents. There are more Thomases than women on the commission. Many of them have been around for, several of them have been serving for over 20 years. And so we, as a result of that resignation, were able to get one of our campaign members appointed to the Peabody Municipal Light Commission. So she's now the one woman on that commission. And we were able to get a retirement date set for one of the old peaker plants. So unfortunately, the new peaker plant was too far along to stop, but we got one of the older ones retired, and the other older one is hopefully going to be retiring soon as well, so that the community doesn't have to deal with 3 power plants in the same place. And as a result of years of advocacy, Peabody finally became a green community last year and is now tapping into state funding. And so here's some photos from our actions in this campaign. So you can see die-in on the bridge that has a view of the power plants. The power plants are right along the river between Peabody and Danvers. Our kayak action as well. We had a lot of folks on the water, on the bridge. We also, a member of the group and a Peabody resident made a documentary about the campaign. So if you're interested in checking it out, it's called Stop Peabody Peaker. It's available online. We had some documentary showings, and that this is the picture in the bottom left is also the premiere of that documentary. And we also had a number of group of 5 or 6 folks go on a hunger strike to call attention to this Peabody peaker, as well as other gas utilities, gas projects in the state. So there was a ton of awareness that was built around this peaker plant, and also the role that MLPs play in this, and the way that this publicly owned utility had fallen short in engaging their own community. So the takeaways here, one, on the plus side, municipal and community ownership has so much potential in terms of unlocking so much more affordability by not having to deal with shareholders as part of the equation and having a different, business model. There's so much innovation that can be unlocked by MLPs trying new things, exploring time of use rates, exploring community solar, and so many other projects that they can try, see how it goes, and also really invest in energy justice and make sure that they're aware of their community's needs and responding directly to them. But community ownership on its own doesn't guarantee good results. It has to come with accountability, with strong community engagement, and some regulation. There have to be rules and parameters for these MLPs to follow to keep pushing them in the right direction. And the community has to be paying attention and showing up and asking questions. And the leaders of the MLP have to be responsive to those community needs in order for this model to really be all of the great things that it can be. I'll leave it there and pass it to, I don't know if it's
Jeremy.
Okay.
Thank you for joining us, Jeremy. If you'd like to introduce yourself and thanks for virtually joining us.
Jeremy, you're still on mute.
Thanks so much for having this event and this workshop, and for having me, and especially for the inconvenience of having me here remotely. I'm very sorry I can't be with you, but I really appreciate making it possible for me to be with you, at least virtually. I'm Jeremy Brecher. I am a historian and writer on labor and social movements. I've written about 15 books, destroyed a lot of trees on those subjects. And what I'd like to do today is put this issue in a somewhat wider context. The focus of this workshop I have seen as overlapping concerns, and how do we use and address the overlapping concerns that people have for climate, economic justice, labor justice, social justice, racial justice, and meeting all of those concerns in a way that is meets the needs of all the particular constituencies involved, as well as for people in general. And the embodiment of that sense of responding to overlapping concerns in the United States over the past half dozen years has largely been around the idea of the Green New Deal. That has drawn together the concerns with climate, with economic justice, and with racial and social justice. And it has been tremendously popular. The poll data, even as recently as last year, indicated that the ideas of the Green New Deal were extremely popular with the broad public, in spite of all the right-wing and fossil fuel attacks on them. During Trump's inaugural address, he said, "My actions today will end the Green New Deal." But the Green New Deal, in fact, lives on in communities, cities, and states around America. It thrives as what AOC called and I call the Green New Deal from below. So what is the Green New Deal from below? The Green New Deal was initially proposed as national legislation. There was a famous sit-in in Nancy Pelosi's office by Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez and the Sunrise Movement. And it was built around the core idea of protecting the climate in ways that reduce injustice and create good jobs. And the Green New Deal legislation was bottled up in Congress by Republicans and by conservative Democrats as well, largely put up to it by fossil fuel interests. But what happened is that at the grassroots, people invented a strategy for outflanking the blockade of the National Green New Deal. They began creating their own Green New Deals locally in communities, states, cities, unions, tribes, in government, and in civil society. And we just heard a couple of wonderful examples of things that, whether they use the name Green New Deal from below or not, are actually alliances of labor, community, justice, and environmental and climate groups around a common program. And that's the essence of what the Green New Deal is all about. And it's the essence of the Green New Deal from below. I began noticing these initiatives and I started writing about them. And eventually I wrote a book that came out a few months ago called The Green New Deal from Below: How Ordinary People Are Building a Just and Climate Safe Economy. And in the book, I describe more than 100 such initiatives in 40 states, some calling themselves Green New Deals from below or calling themselves Green New Deals, and others embodying the same principles and policies. So let me give a few examples, and these are not focused on energy, and then I'm going to come around at the close to talk about energy as part of the Green New Deal from below and part of a local movement to combine social justice, economic justice, jobs, and climate protection. So Boston, as many of you will know, has an official city Green New Deal with a wide range of programs, including climate jobs training, including programs for protecting and restoring areas of the city, especially poor areas of the city that are threatened by the effects of climate change. It moves toward free public transit and many, many other things. I'm going to mention one because part of the focus of this workshop was on co-ops. So this Boston Green New Deal provides free healthy breakfasts, lunches, and snacks for all of the city's 50,000 public school students, produced by a Black and worker-owned co-op in one of the city's poorest neighborhoods. One of the issues is what happens to fossil fuel workers when there's a transition to fossil-free energy. And in West Virginia, the Mine Workers Union, which has been a skeptic about climate change and an opponent of a wide range of efforts to address climate change, nonetheless cooperated to recruit unemployed coal miners to work in a new battery plant designed to help expand solar energy. And the union officials said, well, we have members who desperately need jobs, and we don't care whether they're digging coal or whether they're doing work to build the clean energy economy. We need those jobs, and we're going to help find the workers who have lost their jobs in the mines to find new jobs in the green economy. In Los Angeles, and another focus of this workshop is the role of cities and municipalization. So in Los Angeles, the city's Green New Deal, which again is an official city program, in its first three years reduced climate-destroying emissions by more than a third. And the Green New Deal policies are planned to generate 97% of Los Angeles's energy with renewables by 2030. So is this only a question of blue states and progressive urban centers? In Mississippi, the state is subsidizing rooftop solar, including rebates for low and middle income customers and incentives to solarize schools. And one more, which I didn't know about when I wrote the book, I only discovered it recently. In DeKalb County, Georgia, there is a DeKalb County Green New Deal. It's passed 20 climate action policies, resolutions, and initiatives. And county officials says, and this is echoing something that was said earlier in this workshop about the importance of adapting these programs to local need. County official Ted Terry said, our Green New Deal is specifically a DeKalb Green New Deal. It's what we think we can do with our own resources, our own land, and our own people. And of course, that's critically important now as federal support is being devastated by the Trump administration. Many of these Green New Deal type programs really didn't depend on federal support and are going on, and they can be started without additional new federal support, even though, of course, federal support, which we hope after the rollback of certain current policies, will expand enormously, and that can play a huge role in expanding these Green New Deal from below type programs. But the loss or lack of federal support doesn't prevent us from going ahead. And that's, I think, part of the point of the statement from the county official of the DeKalb Green New Deal. So let me give a couple of, as I say in the book, there's more than 100 examples of these local, county, state. Some of them are union-based, some of them are tribal-based, some of them are based in frontline pollution-threatened communities. And there are many of them that are not specifically energy-oriented. They might be housing programs, but if they're housing programs, they often have a green energy or zero emissions dimension to the housing program. And the first example I want to give is Denver, of a city that has had very, very extensive, in this case, municipal energy programs. So they had a referendum several years back, and they voted to establish a program of community solar gardens throughout Denver. They are on city-owned properties. They're on rooftops of schools and parking lots. They're on vacant land. They're in a variety of city-owned locations. And the ballot measure described what the program that's developed, which is to fund programs to eliminate greenhouse gas emissions and air pollution and adapt to climate change. Funding should maximize investments in communities of color, under-resourced communities, and communities most vulnerable to climate change. And the energy that's being created by the program is allocated to city facilities, low-income residents, and electric vehicle charging stations. There's also a workforce training program which is making jobs in the climate protection energy industries available for people who have been largely excluded from the mainstream labor market. And the plan is part of a broader plan to transition Denver to 100% renewable electricity by 2030. So that's an example of a municipal-based program. there are many, many more around the country. So co-ops are also part of the focus of this workshop. And one of the most interesting examples I know is in a very poor, largely immigrant community in New York City called Sunset Park. Sunset Park was devastated by Superstorm Sandy, and the FEMA and other official relief programs were extremely poor in their response, and they're trying to deal with it. And a local community organization called Uprose played a major role in dealing with the devastation of Sunset Park by Sandy. Also, the Occupy Wall Street movement, hundreds and hundreds of people from who had been involved with occupying Wall Street came and pitched in and created a what they called Operation Sandy Relief, which I visited, provided food, clothing, all kinds of necessities for people who were just being ignored by the official climate welfare operations. So in this community, in Sunset Park, they decided that they would do their own development and try to make their own Green New Deal style community response to rebuilding after the hurricane. They created a cooperative called Sunset Park Solar, which is community owned. It's owned by the low-income customers of the co-op, and it's the first one in the city of New York. And they also made a broader plan for a green, resilient industrial district, a grid, using a term we've heard here before today. And they established that co-op. It's on, the collectors are on the Brooklyn Navy Yard roof. And they began promoting the plan for wider economic development. And the result, and this is a community group that does a lot of direct actions, a lot of pressure campaigns of various kinds. And they succeeded in winning a South Brooklyn Marine Terminal, where wind turbine assembly and maintenance will be done at an industrial hub in South Brooklyn. This one is a federally funded, along with private companies that are trying to develop offshore wind. They're doing port upgrades to make it possible to use the port for offshore wind. And those will create 1,500 short-term jobs and 500 long-term jobs. The plan also involves 30% of the supply chain will be contracted with minority and women-owned companies. And it will also fund offshore wind careers and, as they officially say, support a just transition. So let me briefly just summarize some of the features of these various Green New Deal from below activities. First of all, they are built around an integrating concept, which is jobs and justice through climate protection. It's that overlap that was part of the frame for this workshop. Secondly, integration of constituencies, coalitions, not silos. Almost all of these Green New Deal from below activities and programs are built by, promoted by coalitions that involve unions, that involve climate and environmental groups, and that involve poor and discriminated against communities. That's what makes them, and that's what makes them powerful, is that combination of what used to be considered strange bedfellows. They all involve public planning and investment. So much of our economic policies and programs are based essentially on bribing corporations and bribing wealth holders. We'll give you lots and lots of subsidies if you'll only do the right thing. These are not based, generally speaking, on going begging to private business to do the right thing. They're based on public planning and public investment. And finally, how do these things happen? Well, are these all government initiatives, or are these all community and social movement initiatives? Very characteristically, they are what political scientists are now calling hybrid movements. They involve organizing and action both within the political system and outside. They involve both electoral activities and pressure on elected officials and initiatives by elected officials, and unions, community groups, environmental and climate groups allied, taking initiatives and making pressure from the outside. In many of these cases, the programs were actually originally worked out. The studies were done by the outside groups, and then enough pressure was put on cities and states to bring them to realization. Well, what is this? What's the point of this? What does it achieve? I think there are four main things. One is these programs address people's daily needs. If, as in one of the examples, municipal power is providing people electricity at half the rate that the privately owned power companies are, addressing the problem of people who simply can't pay their energy bills. That is addressing people's daily needs in the most direct way. It's also reducing climate pollution. Again, we heard in one of the previous presentations about closing an old peaker plant near a highly polluted low-income community. And that's, generally speaking, a major part of these programs. Very often they involve shutting down a coal-fired power plant or another highly polluting power plant and replacing it with renewable energy. More broadly, it's a way of fighting injustice. Almost all these programs involve trying to reduce the impact of fossil fuel burning on highly impacted environmental justice communities. And they also involve trying to create job ladders and job access, job training for people who have been excluded from those decent kinds of jobs, and support for unionizing those jobs as a way of making sure that they're decent jobs. Finally, I think all of these programs, looking further into the future, they provide a proof of concept for the whole idea of a Green New Deal, for the whole idea of addressing our climate crisis with programs that also address our crisis of decent jobs and our crisis of social, economic, and racial injustice. So that, I think, is a wider context, and it suggests that the kinds of efforts that have been talked about previously in this program are not only beneficial in themselves, but they're also part of a wider movement and effort which promises a wider alternative moving toward the kind of society that we really need and really want.
Thank you so much.
My name is Cynthia Finney, and we go till 10:30. Yeah, okay, yeah. I definitely want to leave time for questions. So, my name is Cynthia Finney. I'm the president of the Maine AFL-CIO, which is a federation of about 200 different labor organizations around the state and about 40,000 workers. Just as relevant to this discussion is the fact that I'm also a member of the International Brotherhood of Electrical Workers. And for 6 years, about 15 years ago, I was their elected business manager. And we have members all over Maine and New Hampshire. We represent most of the electric utilities in those two states, as well as a couple of other workplaces. Yeah, so Jeremy mentioned coalitions, and we've heard by now a pile of exciting ideas. And I want to talk a little bit just about landscape, and specifically the landscape of the workers who are involved in change, because we're talking about change. In Maine, almost all of the electric utilities are privately owned currently. There's one that's a co-op, I think, and one that's a couple that are municipals left, but the vast number of customers in Maine are customers of privately owned. So if we're talking about some kind of public ownership, we're talking about change. So a question for you, how many of you have a job? How many of you have a boss at your job? Okay, so think about your boss's boss's boss. And now let's say that whoever manages or owns the place that you work for is going to be taken over by someone else. What's going to happen? You don't know exactly. You're going to have a new boss, though. You know that's going to happen. I mean, it might not be your direct boss, might not be your boss's boss, but somewhere up there is going to be a new boss that's going to be either making all the decisions, or if you're fortunate enough to have a union, it's going to be a totally new person to negotiate with. So this is the reality for workers who work in the privately owned utilities in Maine when confronted with a question about whether to change that structure. And it's also, I mean, coalitions are a really good idea because it builds its solidarity across things. But I think any of you who've been organizing for very long know that just because you think something's a good idea and just because your friends think something's a good idea doesn't necessarily mean other people think it's a good idea. And also, if you've pursued ever one of those things that you think is a good idea very far, you probably learn that at least some of what you thought was a good idea isn't actually the best idea. Because as you go along working with other people and hearing what aspect of it they have more expertise than you learn these things. And you can kind of hear in the different models that have been presented how different parts of what was achieved, where people achieved things, responded specifically to situations that were, local and relevant to them. So, how many of you are in a union? Great, bunch of you. How many of you know what the Janus Supreme Court decision is? Oh, good work. Well, for those of you who don't, I'll back up just a little bit. People mostly know that if you have a union, you and your union, some collection of your coworkers, negotiate a contract with your employer. One of the things that you can negotiate if you're in the private sector is what's called a union security clause. And what that means is that anyone who works in one of the jobs that the contract covers can be, if it ends up in your contract that you and the employer agree to, they can be required to contribute to paying for the costs of negotiating the contract and enforcing it through grievance process and whatever the processes are. Lots of contracts include that because it makes your union stronger if the people who are benefiting from the negotiating and enforcement of the contract that you do are contributing to the costs of making that happen. The Janus Supreme Court decision, which is recent, it was just 2018, said that you can't negotiate a contract clause like that if you are in the public sector. So that means for our state workers here in Maine, for anyone that works for that electric utility, municipally owned utility in Kittery, they can't have a contract like that with that clause in it. And so they cannot be required to contribute to the contract that governs their working conditions. So what this means, if you're looking at public utilities and privately owned utilities and thinking about a transition to making them public, is that one of the considerations for those workers is what's that going to mean for the strength of their union if all of a sudden they can't require everyone who's covered by their contract to be included in it. And I think another piece of landscape, well, I won't go to that one quite yet. So we had a campaign for public power here in Maine. And early on, that was a piece of legislation before it became a referendum. Early on in that campaign, the people who are interested in seeing that change in our state had some really great conversations with the union that was involved, which is my union. Although I was working for the AFL-CIO at the time, so I wasn't part of those conversations very much. I was in on a couple of them. They did a lot of work to try to understand what the union wanted and needed in a bill in order to be able to support it. And it's part of why the Pine Tree Power Bill, they tried very hard to shape a model that would avoid that coming under the Janus decision. They put a lot of terms and conditions in that would protect jobs. They put a lot of terms and conditions in that would give the workers some power over who was running the entity that would control the new power thing. But in the end, the union attorneys weren't convinced that this was going to protect them from the Janus threat, which union members may disagree. They do disagree about all kinds of things, but a whole lot of them across the political spectrum love their union and understand that their union is important. And so even though it seems like an arcane detail, possibly, it actually matters to union members. So one more piece of landscape, and I'll wrap up in just a minute because I want to get to Q&A. One more piece of landscape. Working at an electric utility one of the things that you do is, for one thing, a lot of people are just incredibly, electricity, think of what it makes possible in our lives. People are really proud and pleased to contribute to bringing that resource to people. And people work together in storms for many hours a day. They don't even see their family sometimes. They go away to work. Even as a meter reader, I sometimes went out of town to help other crews during storms and things like that. And what happens when you do work like that, as in some other professions, is that you develop a family kind of feeling with your coworkers. And you also, no matter how upset you are and how unfair you think your employer is some of the time, you also love being part of the company that's bringing this important resource to your community. And so there's loyalty there kind of on both sides. And so I think it's important to remember when we hear if there's been successful work to build a program that's going to be supported by both labor and environmental groups and people like that, when we hear about those successes, it might mean luck, but it probably means a lot of work went into having those conversations and also into building a campaign. And it probably means if that legislation or program or policy isn't a top policy for the union itself, the last piece of landscape is that those union leaders have too much to do. So you can't just talk to a union leader and walk away from the campaign, even if that union leader agrees with you. It takes support, it takes conversations with members, it takes building a campaign that engages those union leaders and getting agreement and understanding and communication all along the way. And that if you can't do that, then you're actually leaving those workers to wonder what's going to happen. Bad things are going to happen. Who's the boss going to be? And those are real questions that deserve real answers for workers, and they deserve to be at the table throughout the whole process. And I think, given the time, that's all I want to say. So, yeah.
I'm really looking forward to hearing questions and comments. What conversation so far brought to mind for me is Bernice Reagan quote, who was in Sweet Honey in the Rock, a civil rights organizer, and she said, if you're doing coalition work and it isn't difficult, you're not doing coalition work, right? So even though I'd like to reframe that a little and think of it as growing pains, right? We know Matt, Katie, and the staff have done a wonderful job bringing different interests together, but we can't, like Cynthia said, we can't let it go at one conversation, right? We need to be long-term if we truly want to build together. So with that said, let's open up to questions, comments. If anyone wants to help with stack, depending on how many people, who has a comment, question?
I had a question about the MLPs. You mentioned that they have a kind of a limiting independence from regulations in Massachusetts that would push them to adopt renewables. Thinking about states that are currently passing laws that sometimes ban clean energy incentives, make it really hard to implement clean energy incentives. Would that same independence, that same structure, be a way to insulate MLPs from those kind of bans and restrictions?
Yeah, it's an interesting question. I think it can go both ways, right? If the state is heading in not the direction that we're looking for, then MLPs having more flexibility and independence means that they could push the envelope regardless. I think it depends a little bit on the state context and also on the leadership of the MLP and community accountability. Because if, the MLP in theory is going to be responsive to their community, so that would also take organizing and, a push for MLP leadership to head in that direction, despite the state heading in a different one.
Had a great 2-day conference and I've learned a ton, but part of it's just been heartbreaking in terms of what is now being lost with our new president. Almost, and the people during the campaign would say, oh, there's no difference between Biden and Trump. And it seems like every time I open the newspaper article, there's so much of a difference. So 2 things is, one is like a resource to look at what is being lost as we go and re-engage in those conversations. So dramatic and so overreaching. And then the second is, what can we do now for the next 2 years, given that the whole framework of this incredible work in so many different areas is now minutes or less.
I think anyone could answer, but Jeremy, does that, did that hit a nerve?
So let me not try to bite on the first one, because I'm not, I think the daily newspaper or online news source is probably the best listing of what is being lost day by day that you'll find. Any compendium that's happening longer term is probably going to be behind the curve. Surely there'll be a time for making a compendium of that kind, but I don't know of any that exists other than the daily accounts of what has the Trump administration done so far. On the second one, this is, of course, a hugely important question, and one that thousands and thousands of people need to weigh in on. I just say a couple of things. The first one is that there needs to be a public, visible opposition to the Trump regime and the MAGA assault on democracy and on people. And this is April 5. This is the nationwide hands-off demonstrations. I think they're likely to be the first, but certainly not the last expression of that effort to push back and undermine the power and eventually eliminate the power of the MAGA forces. And I think that we're all disappointed in the weakness of the Democratic Party's efforts to play a role as the opposition to the Trump juggernaut. And what we're seeing is the development of what I call a non-electoral opposition, which brings together all the people who are being hurt, which is surely a vast majority of Americans, and all the groups and constituencies that are being harmed by the Trump administration, and makes it doesn't have to be one organization, it doesn't have to be one umbrella group, but it needs to be a concerted alignment of groups that are saying we are going to make a forceful opposition, and we're going to do it in a way that brings together all the different people who are being hurt by representing their interests and supporting each other in our mutual struggles against this. So that's the negative piece. I think the positive piece is what Gandhi had his constructive program, which went along with the vast anti-colonial civil disobedience movements in India in the fight against British imperialism. Along with them was a constructive program, which was developing in the villages of India an alternative that would be the basis for an alternative that people could look to and say, yes, that's what we want to do. And a motivation for getting rid of these imperialists who are running our country is that we can make our own from the grassroots up new economic and social arrangements. And I think the Green New Deal from below potentially represents very much that kind of constructive initiative for us, bringing together the overlapping concerns of workers, of climate and environmental concerns, and concerns of oppressed and discriminated against groups. So I think the kinds of efforts we heard about today and the other Green New Deal from below type programs and activities are a significant part of the resistance to the MAGA assault, going along with and hand in hand with all the efforts that are designed to undermine its support and undermine its ability to implement its program.
So much. I think we have one more hand, one more question.
Camilo, if I can add to this
sure.
really fast, and then we'll take your question. I'll make time. I think one of the things to answer this gentleman's question is that things weren't great before either. So I've been working on these issues of energy affordability for over 7 years now, which, believe it or not, puts me in the upper echelon of people working on energy poverty in the United States in terms of time. And so I think that now is a moment where I'm very grateful for the University of Southern Maine for pulling us together, because it's time for these conversations about what big transformative efforts look like, right? We won't have, it won't be good enough to just try to pick up where we were before. We have to invent really big new systems. I think to Cynthia's great point, it means overturning Janus. It means protecting workers' rights. It means changing some of these recent Supreme Court laws that have restricted our political freedoms and made it so that always corporations come out on top. We're talking about getting rid of Citizens United. We're talking about guaranteeing that we have a right to housing, healthcare, electricity, clean water, clean air, right? The work now, I think, is of coming together and having these discussions about what those big changes look like, coming to those agreements amongst ourselves, workers and communities, because we're losing time, very, very valuable time. And so it won't be enough to just say, well, we'll go back to 4 months ago, right? We have to figure out how are we leaping forward together. So, and I think that is what the big public power fight is about, is putting a very material need at the center of this big climate and labor fight.
Comment and a question. Cynthia spoke about the public power campaign here in Maine. And the Janus concerns was also that public employees do not have the right to strike. And Jeremy, I actually have with me my copy of Strike that you wrote, not realizing you weren't going to be here. I was hoping you would sign it. But my question goes to, how do we ensure, if employees are part of a public entity, that the ability to engage in concerted activity and strike is really important for their ability to gain adequate wages and working conditions? What do we do, or what to ensure that if they are to become public employees? Thank you.
Thanks for adding that. I meant to include it and was trying to hurry. So thank you.
I think Cynthia, I'd love to hear Cynthia's answer to that.
Well, it's interesting because, we've tried to, there's various ways that the strike, even when it's legal, is constrained. And I think we'll have more conversation about this in the final panel for the day. But how we need to do that is they are laws that need to be overturned. But I think also in the interim, and I'll talk about this more in the panel later today, but in the interim, Jeff said it right, that almost right, that they don't have the right to strike. They don't have the legal right to strike. That didn't stop the teachers in West Virginia. It didn't stop the teachers in Los Angeles. And, but yeah, we need to change the laws, and it'll be an uphill fight, but it's one that we have to make because that is our power.
Thank you so much. And if you haven't read that book, Strike, I think it's timely. Jeremy, that's how I first learned Jeremy, of his authorship and leadership on this issue. But thank you so much for all the panelists and everyone that's a participant in this conference. And I look forward to working together.
Thank you. Thank you all.
Thanks, Jeremy.